Have you ever been in a room full of people who love you and felt completely, utterly alone? Not the kind of alone that comes from physical distance, but the soul-crushing isolation that happens when everyone's looking at you and somehow nobody sees you at all. That's what happened to me at what was supposed to be a simple family dinner, the kind of evening that should have been filled with laughter, good food, and the comfortable chaos of people who've known you your whole life. Instead, it became the night I realized I'd been living in a toxic marriage story I'd been too afraid to name. When my husband looked around that table and said, "Everyone agrees with me," something inside me broke, or maybe it finally woke up. 5 simple words that revealed years of gaslighting, emotional manipulation, marriage tactics, and a control so subtle I'd mistaken it for love. I'd spent so long seeking his approval, trying to be reasonable, attempting to see things from his perspective, that I'd completely lost sight of my own voice. And the worst part? My family, people who'd watched me grow up, who'd celebrated my achievements and comforted my failures, sat there in silence, nodding along as if his version of reality was the only one worth acknowledging. If you've ever felt dismissed by a controlling husband, if you've ever questioned your own sanity because someone convinced you that everyone saw things their way, if you've ever experienced that particular brand of silent revenge marriage where you're punished not with anger but with manufactured consensus, this story is for you. Because what happened next wasn't what anyone expected, least of all me. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a theatrical exit. It was something far more powerful, an emotional power reversal that began the moment I stopped asking for permission to trust myself. This is the story of how I found my voice again, not by shouting louder, but by finally understanding that the only agreement that mattered was the one I made with myself. It's a dark relationship drama with an unexpected ending, one where female empowerment story isn't about revenge or victory over someone else, but about the quiet, revolutionary act of choosing yourself when everyone else has chosen differently. And it started with 5 words that were meant to silence me but instead became the catalyst for everything that followed. Sarah had been looking forward to the dinner for weeks. Her sister was hosting and the whole family would be there, aunts, uncles, cousins she hadn't seen since last summer. She'd even bought a new dress, something soft and floral that made her feel like herself again, a version she'd almost forgotten. Mark, her husband, had seemed supportive when she mentioned it, nodding along as she talked about who'd be there and what her sister might cook. Everything felt warm, unified, like they were walking into this gathering as a team. But there's something peculiar about toxic marriage stories. They don't announce themselves with warning signs at family dinners. They slip in quietly, disguised as normal conversation, as reasonable opinions shared over mashed potatoes and wine. Sarah sat between Mark and her cousin Jenny, laughing at her uncle's terrible jokes, feeling that rare sense of belonging she'd been craving. Her emotional guard, usually so carefully maintained, had lowered completely. She was home, or at least she thought she was. The conversation drifted toward renovations. Her sister and brother-in-law were redoing their kitchen. Sarah mentioned she'd love to update their bathroom, something she and Mark had discussed months ago. It wasn't a demand, just a thought shared aloud, the way people do when they feel safe. She glanced at Mark, expecting that small nod of agreement, that partner in crime smile they used to share. Instead, she saw his jaw tighten, that subtle shift she'd learned to recognize but had been trying to ignore. What happened next would become the moment everything changed, though she didn't know it yet. Mark set down his fork with deliberate care, the kind of movement that draws attention without making a sound. He looked around the table, making eye contact with nearly everyone before his gaze finally landed back on her. The controlling husband she'd been making excuses for was about to reveal himself in front of everyone she loved, and somehow, that made it worse than all the times had done it behind closed doors. Mark's voice carried that particular tone, calm, reasonable, almost apologetic, the one he used when he wanted to sound like the adult in the room. "Actually, everyone agrees with me that the bathroom is fine as it is," he said, gesturing vaguely around the table as if conducting an invisible orchestra of support. Sarah felt her stomach drop, that sickening lurch you get when the ground disappears beneath your feet. He wasn't just disagreeing with her, he was invoking an army she hadn't realized had been recruited. The phrase hung in the air like smoke, settling over everything, claiming territory she didn't know was being contested. Her sister looked down at her plate. Her mother suddenly became very interested in refilling water glasses. This was gaslighting in its most insidious form, not a direct attack, but an emotional manipulation marriage strategy that erased Sarah's voice by pretending it had already been democratically outvoted. She hadn't been consulted about this supposed consensus. Nobody had asked her opinion before Mark apparently held this invisible referendum. Yet here he sat, borrowing authority from the crowd, transforming a simple home improvement wish into evidence of her unreasonableness. I didn't know we'd discussed this with everyone, Sarah said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. She looked around the table, searching for eye contact, for someone to say they'd never had this conversation. But faces remained carefully neutral, studying their plates or their drinks, anywhere but her eyes. The controlling husband mechanism was working perfectly. It isolated her without anyone noticing, made her the problem without raising his voice, turned her reasonable desire into something that required group intervention. What struck her most wasn't Mark's manipulation. She'd experienced versions of this before, though never quite so publicly. It was the silence of everyone else. The way her family, people who'd known her since she was born, people who'd watched her grow up and become herself, suddenly acted like his version of reality was the only one worth acknowledging. Individual voice erased just like that, with 5 words and a gesture. Everyone agrees with me. As if agreement were a weapon, consensus a cage, and she'd just been locked inside while her family held the keys. The rest of the dinner became a masterclass in isolation, though nobody would have called it that if you'd asked them later. Sarah sat there, fork in hand, while conversation flowed around her like water around a stone. Her aunt started talking about her garden, her cousin mentioned a new job, and life just continued as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. She'd been emotionally exiled from her own family gathering, and the worst part was how easily everyone had let it happen. No one met her eyes anymore, not really, just those quick glances people give when they're checking if you're okay but don't actually want to know the answer. Mark played his part beautifully, she had to admit that much. He laughed at jokes, asked interested questions, even complimented her sister's roast chicken with genuine enthusiasm. To anyone watching, he was the perfect husband, attentive, engaged, reasonable. Meanwhile, Sarah felt like she was watching the scene through glass, separate and untouchable. This toxic marriage story was writing itself in real time, and she was both protagonist and audience, trapped in a narrative where her feelings didn't count because they'd been deemed unreasonable by popular vote. She tried once more, gently, to explain her perspective. I just thought it would be nice to update things a bit, that's all. Her voice sounded small even to her own ears, apologetic in a way that made her skin crawl. Mark didn't even look at her when he responded, just shook his head with that patient smile he reserved for when she was being difficult. Her own mother, patted Mark's hand sympathetically, as if he were the one enduring something challenging. The silent message was clear: stop making trouble, stop causing tension, stop being so unreasonable when everyone else can see the truth. Compliance was expected, and Sarah could feel the weight of that expectation pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing. Nobody said the words out loud, but the emotional manipulation marriage playbook doesn't need explicit instructions. It works through silence, through averted eyes, through the subtle ways people withdraw their support without ever actually saying they're doing it. She was supposed to laugh it off, apologize for bringing it up, maybe make a joke about being silly. That's what would restore harmony, what would let everyone relax again. But something inside her, something she'd almost forgotten existed, refused to perform that particular scene. Sarah did something that night that surprised even herself. She stayed quiet. Not the compliant, apologetic quiet Mark expected. Not the defeated silence of someone who'd accepted their place in the hierarchy. This was different, sharper, a quietness that came from observation rather than submission. She took a sip of wine, set down her glass with steady hands, and simply watched Mark charm her family, watched her sister avoid looking in her direction, watched the whole performance unfold like a play she'd somehow been watching from backstage her entire marriage. There was no public defense, no dramatic scene, nothing that would give anyone ammunition to call her emotional or unstable later. What nobody at that table understood, what Mark certainly didn't understand, was that silence can be a form of awakening. While he continued to orchestrate the evening, Sarah's internal awareness sharpened with each passing moment. She noticed how he touched her shoulder in that proprietary way when telling a story, claiming ownership while appearing affectionate. She saw how her father nodded along to Mark's opinions about politics, work, life, as if her husband of 5 years somehow had more authority than she did on subjects she'd studied, lived, breathed. This wasn't just about a bathroom anymore, and maybe it never had been. The controlling husband pattern became so clear it was almost laughable. How had she not seen it before? Every decision they'd made, every choice about their life together, had somehow ended with "everyone agrees with me," or "people think," or "anyone would say." Mark never claimed these opinions as his own. He borrowed them from invisible others, made himself the mouthpiece of reasonable society. And she'd been fighting against ghosts, arguing with phantoms, trying to defend herself against an army that didn't actually exist. The gaslighting had been so smooth, so persistent, that she'd started to believe her own voice didn't matter. But hey race, what happens when someone stops defending and starts observing? Emotional distance forms like ice on a winter pond, thin at first, then thick enough to walk on. Sarah felt it spreading through her chest, that cold clarity she'd been too afraid to acknowledge. She smiled when appropriate, responded when spoken to, even helped clear the dishes when dinner ended. To everyone else, she'd settled down, accepted reality, returned to being the reasonable woman they all preferred. What they didn't see was the wall going up, brick by brick, between who she'd been trying to be and who she actually was. The drive home was quiet, but this time Sarah didn't try to fill the silence with forced conversation or nervous chatter. Mark seemed pleased with himself, humming along to the radio, probably thinking he'd handled the dinner perfectly. And he had, in a way, had demonstrated his control, reinforced his authority, and done it all while appearing completely reasonable. What he didn't realize was that Sarah was conducting her own review of the evening, replaying not just tonight but years of similar moments she'd explained away as misunderstandings or bad timing. The realization of long-term isolation hit her like a wave. She'd been alone in this marriage far longer than just tonight. Over the next few days, something shifted in Sarah's perception, like adjusting a camera lens until everything suddenly comes into focus. She started remembering other gatherings, other moments when Mark had invoked group consensus to shut down her ideas. That vacation she'd wanted to take. Everyone thinks it's too expensive. The career move she'd considered. People would say you're being impulsive. Even the small things like what color to paint the living room or which restaurant to choose for their anniversary. Each time, Mark had presented himself as the messenger of collective wisdom, when really he'd just been manufacturing agreement to mask his own desire for control. This toxic marriage story had been unfolding in slow motion, so gradually that Sarah had adapted to each new restriction without recognizing the pattern. It's like that old metaphor about boiling a frog. Change the temperature slowly enough, and you never notice you're being cooked. But now she noticed everything. How Mark checked in with her during conversations in a way that looked caring but was actually monitoring. How he made decisions and presented them as joint choices they'd already agreed upon. How her friends had slowly disappeared from her life because they were dramatic or not good influences, according to the mysterious everyone who agreed with him. Understanding that the agreement had been manufactured, that there was no actual consensus, just Mark's skilled manipulation of social dynamics, changed everything. Sarah stopped seeking validation from him, stopped trying to convince him her feelings were legitimate, stopped attempting to win arguments she'd never actually been allowed to enter. Self-trust began to return, tentative at first, like a muscle she hadn't used in years. She started making small decisions without consulting him: what to have for lunch, which route to drive to work, what book to read before bed. Tiny rebellions that probably seemed insignificant to anyone watching, but felt like reclaiming territory she'd surrendered without realizing it. The shift happened internally first, in a place Mark couldn't see or control. Sarah stopped waiting for permission, not dramatically, not with announcements or confrontations, but simply by ceasing to ask. When he suggested they spend Saturday with his parents, she mentioned she'd already made plans to visit an old friend. When he started a sentence with "don't you think we should," she replied with a calm "I've already decided," that left no room for negotiation. These weren't battles, they were boundaries, erected quietly but firmly. The emotional manipulation marriage tactics that had worked for years suddenly met resistance they couldn't bend or break. What made this moment the true climax wasn't any single dramatic event, it was the accumulation of small refusals that signaled a fundamental power shift. Mark tried his usual approaches: the reasonable tone, the disappointed sighs, the implications that she was being difficult or unreasonable. But Sarah had discovered something revolutionary: she didn't need to defend her choices or justify her decisions to someone who'd never genuinely considered her perspective anyway. External validation, which she'd been desperately seeking from him and from everyone, was replaced by an internal clarity that felt like coming home to herself. The beauty of this dark relationship drama reversal was its silence. There was no confrontation required, no ultimatums delivered, no therapy sessions where they'd hash out their differences. Sarah simply stopped participating in the dynamic that had kept her small. When Mark invoked his favorite phrase at home one evening, everyone would agree that "you're overreacting," she looked at him with calm eyes and said, "Maybe. But I disagree, and that's enough." The sentence hung between them like a bridge burning, and she could see the confusion flicker across his face. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. Power recentered itself in that moment, shifting from his hands back to hers. It wasn't loud or vengeful. This silent revenge marriage dynamic didn't require her to hurt him the way he'd hurt her. It simply required her to stop giving him authority over her reality. She stopped explaining herself, stopped seeking his approval, stopped pretending that his manufactured consensus meant anything real. The controlling husband found himself facing someone he didn't recognize, not angry, not broken, just fundamentally unavailable for the games he'd been playing. And that, she realized, was the most powerful position she'd ever held. Mark's first instinct was to escalate, to reinforce the group pressure that had always worked before. He started calling her family more frequently, casually mentioning Sarah's odd behavior in conversations with her mother, her sister, anyone who might help restore the old order. "I'm worried about her," he'd say, his voice dripping with concern that sounded genuine if you didn't know better. He'd suggest family dinners, game nights, any gathering where he could recreate that consensus dynamic. But something had changed. Sarah attended these events with polite distance, smiled at the right moments, and refused to engage when he tried to bait her into disagreements he could then publicly resolve. The confusion on Mark's face was almost comical when his isolation tactics failed to land. He'd make a comment designed to embarrass her, wait for that familiar flash of hurt in her eyes, but instead she'd just sip her coffee and change the subject. He'd invoke everyone again. "Everyone thinks you've been distant lately," and she'd respond with a serene "that's interesting" that gave him nothing to work with. This wasn't the woman he'd married, or rather, this wasn't the woman he'd carefully molded over 5 years of emotional manipulation marriage techniques. This was someone else entirely, someone who'd stopped caring about his opinion of her. The loss of narrative control clearly unsettled him in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. Mark had built his entire sense of self around being the reasonable one, the one people agreed with, the steady hand guiding their life together. But you can't guide someone who's no longer looking to you for direction. He tried different approaches, playing the hurt husband, the confused partner who just wanted to understand what had changed. He even attempted tenderness, bringing home flowers and suggesting they reconnect. But female empowerment story arcs don't reverse because someone brings roses. They're written in the ink of self-recognition, and that's permanent. What Mark didn't understand, what controlling husbands rarely understand, is that authority borrowed from others is only as strong as the victim's belief in it. Once Sarah stopped believing that everyone mattered more than her own voice, his power evaporated like morning fog. She watched him try harder, reach further, grasp at the control that was slipping through his fingers like water. His desperation would have been sad if it weren't so revealing. All these years, she'd thought he was strong, certain, backed by the collective wisdom he claimed to represent. But now she could see the truth. Had been weak all along, propping himself up with her compliance, building his confidence from her diminishment. Race, what Sarah learned, what anyone trapped in similar dynamics needs to understand: consensus can be manipulation when it's invoked without your participation. Real agreement involves discussion, negotiation, genuine consideration of different perspectives. But when someone tells you everyone agrees without ever having asked for your input, they're not reporting consensus, they're manufacturing it, wielding social pressure like a weapon to make you doubt your own reality. The gaslighting isn't always obvious, isn't always cruel sounding. Sometimes it comes wrapped in reasonable tones and borrowed authority, making you feel crazy for trusting yourself over the imaginary majority. Isolation thrives on silence, but not the victim's silent sight thrives on everyone else's. Sarah's family wasn't malicious, they were uncomfortable, conflict avoidant, willing to look away rather than challenge Mark's version of reality. That's how emotional power reversal happens in toxic marriage stories, slowly, with the complicity of good people who don't want to get involved. Every time someone stayed silent when Mark diminished her, they reinforced his control. Every averted gaze, every changed subject, every moment of choosing comfort over truth became another brick in the wall surrounding her. But walls built by silence can crumble just as quietly. The transformative discovery, the one that changes everything, just that self-trust ends group control completely and permanently. Once you stop seeking permission from people who've proven they don't have your best interests at heart, their opinions lose their power over you. Mark's "everyone agrees with me" only worked because Sarah had been asking the wrong question. She had been asking, "Am I right?" when she should have been asking, "Do I trust myself?" The answer to the first question could be debated, manipulated, twisted by someone skilled in emotional manipulation marriage tactics. But the answer to the second question belonged to her alone. Power returns when you stop asking permission, when you stop explaining, when you stop believing that other people's comfort matters more than your own truth. This isn't about becoming selfish or isolated, it's about recognizing that healthy relationships don't require you to diminish yourself for someone else's authority. Sarah's story, like so many dark relationship drama narratives that end in liberation rather than tragedy, teaches us that the most radical act is sometimes just trusting yourself more than you trust someone else's version of who you should be. The controlling husband loses control the moment you stop handing it to him. And everyone stops agreeing the moment you stop caring whether they do. So hey race, what I want you to ask yourself, right now, in this moment, who are you seeking permission from? Whose version of everyone has been dictating your choices, your voice, your sense of what's reasonable or right? Because if there's one thing this toxic marriage story taught me, it's that the most dangerous prison is the one we build ourselves, brick by brick, every time we choose someone else's comfort over our own truth. You don't need a dramatic family gathering humiliation to recognize the patterns. Maybe it's happening in smaller ways, quieter moments, those tiny erosions of self that seem insignificant until you look back and realize how far you've drifted from who you actually are. Think about the last time you changed your mind because someone invoked group consensus without ever actually asking the group. When was the last time you swallowed your opinion because speaking up felt like causing trouble? These aren't small things, they're the foundation of emotional manipulation, marriage dynamics, the building blocks of gaslighting that convinces you your reality doesn't count. But hey race, the beautiful, terrifying, absolutely liberating truth: you can stop participating in that dynamic right now. Not tomorrow, not after one more conversation, not when conditions are perfect. Right now, in whatever situation you're facing, you can choose to trust yourself more than you trust someone else's manufactured version of what everyone thinks. This isn't about becoming confrontational or burning bridges or declaring war on everyone who's ever made you feel small. The emotional power reversal I experienced wasn't loud or vengeful, it was the quiet, steady reclamation of my own voice, my own choices, my own right to disagree with the consensus. It's about recognizing that healthy relationships, real love, genuine family connections don't require you to erase yourself for someone else's authority. They don't demand silence when you have something to say. They don't manufacture agreement to avoid discomfort. And they certainly don't use everyone as a weapon against your individual truth. So what's your next step going to be? What's one small decision you can make today without seeking permission, without explanation, without checking if it aligns with what everyone thinks? Maybe it's as simple as choosing what you want for dinner, or as significant as reconsidering a relationship that's been slowly suffocating you. Whatever it is, I want you to practice that radical act of self-trust. And if this story resonated with you, if you saw pieces of your own dark relationship drama in these words, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, because we're going to keep exploring these hard truths, these silent revenge marriage dynamics, these female empowerment stories that don't get told enough. You're not alone in feeling alone. But you don't have to stay there. The controlling husband, the manipulative partner, the gaslighting family member, they only have as much power as you give them. And today, right now, you can start taking that power back.